Okay,
Yes.
well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dave Ulrich. I co-dean the EPA Alumni Association Academy with my distinguished colleague, Lydia Wegman. I'm formerly of Region 5, 30 years, just a mere pittance in time compared to our featured speaker today, Walter Mugdan, who is in his 48th year with US EPA, which I'm not sure if that's a record or not, but it's got to be pretty close if it isn't. Walter has served in a number of capacities over the years, including acting regional administrator, currently the DRA. He's been director of a number of divisions, a number of positions in the Office of Regional Counsel. And I learned from his bio that, and perhaps the secret to his success, his undergrad education came in the Midwest in Region 5 at the University of Michigan. So I'm sure that had a lot to do with his distinguished career. So with no further ado, I am going to turn it over to Walter Mugdan, who is going to tell us all about the cleanup of the Hudson River. Walter, take it away.
And I'm going to share my screen here and make sure that folks can see this. Are you seeing this, Dave? On your screen?
Yeah.
All right, so I was asked to talk a little bit about one of our most venerable Superfund sites in Region 2, the Hudson River PCB's Superfund site. And let me start off with a little bit of a, let's see if I can get the slides to advance. That'll be the most important thing. Yeah, so we're going to start off with a little bit of a timeline here. And by the way, the format is going to be that I'm going to show this little PowerPoint presentation for maybe 15, 20, 25 minutes. And then Dave is going to pepper me with a number of questions. And of course, I presume there'll be some time for others to ask questions as well. So timeline, back in 1947, PCBs started to get widely used, and there were two General Electric plants on the Hudson River about 40 miles north of Albany who used the PCBs to make capacitors. And it's estimated that over this 30-year period, about 1.3 million pounds of PCBs were discharged into the river. And a lot of them were discharged into the river behind this dam that you see on the photograph there in the lower left, lower right corner. And they, the PCBs, of course, stick to sediments, as people know, the fine sediments. That's where these contaminants usually adhere to. And most of those sediments were accumulating behind this dam. But in 1973, this dam was removed. It was owned by a power company, and the power company didn't need it anymore, and they took the dam down. And as a consequence, the PCB contaminated sediments really poured downstream all the way to New York City, about 200 miles away. And not surprisingly, the highest concentrations are right there near this town of Fort Edward, which is where these two plants were located. There's a series of dams over that 40-mile stretch down to Troy, which is right near Albany, a series of dams, and each dam has a little less of the sediment and a little less concentrations of PCBs in the pool behind that dam as you go down. Once you reach Albany, from there, the 150 miles down to New York City are free flowing. There are no more dams. And it's estuarine there, so the tidal influence continues to have the water go in both directions in much of that stretch. In 1975, PCBs were already something that we were paying attention to. It was right at the beginning of when that was the contaminant du jour, as people may remember from 1975. And the state of New York sued General Electric for contamination and issued health advisories telling people, no, don't eat the fish from this area. And they banned commercial fishing in the lower river. The Hudson River was the second largest and most prominent striped bass commercial fishery in the US. Only the Chesapeake Bay had a more important one. And that was all shut down as a result of PCB contamination. And during 76 to 78, the DC started to survey the river sediments, and lo and behold, found a lot of PCB concentrations there. Of course, in 1977, EPA banned most PCB manufacturing and a lot of uses under TSCA, although there's still plenty of PCBs around even to this day. 1980, Superfund was enacted, and in 1984, we added the Hudson River PCB site to the national priorities list under the Superfund law. And you see here on the right-hand side, a little map, you'll see that the upper Hudson is that section in the 40 miles north of Troy, which is where the last dam is. And then the lower Hudson is all the section down to New York City. In '84, we put it on the NPL, but almost right away, we issued an interim no action record of decision saying, well, there's not enough information right now. We can't call for dredging because we don't know enough about it. It might make matters worse, but we're going to reassess it. And in '89, we started that reassessment, and it ran until 2000. It took a long time. It was heavily engaged. We had heavy engagements with General Electric. Finally, in 2000, literally in the waning days of the Clinton administration, Carol Browner came up to Region 2, and she personally announced the proposed remedial action plan for the upper Hudson River. And after some political intrigue in 2002, we issued a record of decision. I'm hearing a little bit of background noise. Is there, maybe somebody can put themselves on mute.
Please mute yourself, audience, if you are not muted already. Thank you.
Thanks. So during this whole period of time that we were doing the reassessment, GE was vigorously arguing against any record of decision that would call for dredging or extensive dredging. And they had four basic arguments. Number one, PCBs aren't that harmful. False. They're pretty bad. Number two, the river will heal itself. That was true, but it would happen very, very, very slowly, and we felt we needed to accelerate that. Number three, they argued, oh, dredging is going to make matters much, much worse. That's false if it is done properly, and it was, as you'll see in a moment. And they also said, oh, it's going to make life miserable for all the nearby communities. And that was also false, and it turned out to be actually a pretty interesting and a pretty good program. GE spent millions of dollars. We estimated about possibly as much as $60 million on public relations during this decade, trying to have a campaign to thwart the dredging proposal. So when we look at aquatic environments and contaminants in sediments, it's almost always all about the fish. We understand biomagnification. You got the little critters that pick up the PCBs. You got the bigger critter fish that eat those. You got the bigger fish that eat the littler fish. And eventually you got people or other top of the food chain organisms, mink, otter, ospreys, eagles, and so forth, who eat the bigger fish. And each step along the way, there's biomagnification of the contaminants. And that's why people at the organisms at the top of the food chain have a pretty high, can get a pretty high contaminant load, even if the concentrations in the sediment and in the water are comparatively low. It's through this biomagnification process. So in 2002, we issued our record of decision, or the ROD, and it was based upon a lot of modeling. And the modeling was using this widely accepted assumption that if you can reduce the PCB load in the sediments, you'll achieve reduction of the PCB load in the water column. And between those two things, you're also going to get reduced PCBs in the fish because of this whole food chain phenomenon. And so the ROD called for dredging of the worst areas in this 40-mile stretch of the upper Hudson River between Troy and Fort Edward. And that was going to be we estimated 2.65 million cubic yards would have to be dug up. And then we said, and the remaining areas that are not going to be dredged, and that would actually be the majority of the acreage, would have to improve through what we call natural attenuation. That's the natural processes. And even with all that dredging, it's still going to take 50 to 60 years for the fish to improve sufficiently. So what does sufficiently meant? Well, we had a final milestone for the amount of PCBs in fish that are acceptable for people to eat the fish. But we knew that it was going to take forever to get there, 50 years, 60 years. So we set some interim milestones and said, within in about 5 years after dredging, we predicted that the average concentration in the fish would be 0.4 milligrams per kilogram. And at that level, it would be okay for people to eat one fish meal every 2 months. And after about 16 years after dredging, we said you get down to about 0.2 milligrams per kilogram. And there you can eat about one fish meal every 1 month. So those are our interim milestones. And this becomes important because, spoiler alert, we haven't hit the first milestone, even though it's more than 5 years after dredging. So that's one of the elements of the controversy that we're now engaged in. The record of decision used an interesting approach that we don't use anymore, and we probably wouldn't use today if we were doing this record of decision today. First of all, the river was organized, a 40-mile stretch was organized into 3 river sections with progressively less contamination as you go south. And each of these three, we set a different cleanup standard. And that's controversial because some of the NGOs that are challenging us today say, hey, you really should have had the same cleanup standard for the entire 40 miles, or at least the same in river section 1 and in 2. The way in which the cleanup standard was expressed was in mass per unit area. And that's a little unusual, and it isn't much used anymore. What we basically imagine is that if you can imagine a segment of sediment below the water, which is 1 meter on each side, 1 meter square, and then goes all the way down to the bottom until you get to the bottom of the sediment, until you hit bedrock. And you calculate all of the PCBs in that unit area of sediment. That's the standard. We set the standard for river section 1 at 3 grams per meter squared, but it's, again, think of it as going a column of sediment going all the way to the bottom. And in river section 2, it was 10. And in river section 3, it was so-called select. It was like, well, we'll select the areas where you got to dredge. So here's a cartoon of the river, and you got these different river sections separated by the heavy black lines. Section 1 at the top, section 2, which has a second dam within it, or another dam within it, and section 3, which has 4 dams within it. So we called the record of decision 3-10 select, because it was 3 and 10 and select as you go down the river sections. Fundamentally, the select ended up being 10 as well as a de facto thing. So it was 3-10-10. And the big controversy with the NGOs is, after the fact, after we were done with the red dredging, they said, well, why didn't you do river section 2 at 3, the same way you did river section 1? It's nearly as badly contaminated. So that's really the controversy. So the question is, well, why didn't we dredge more? So at the time we were generating the record of decision, we did model a much more aggressive dredging option. In fact, more aggressive than what even the NGOs or some of the NGOs are now calling for. And that option was predicted to accelerate the achievement of these 2 interim targets, milestones, by only a few years. And you can see it there. For the first target, we would accelerate it by about 2 years, and the second one about 6 years. We said that it's much more expensive, it's much more intrusive, it'll take longer to do, and we concluded it was not worth what is the phrase? The juice was not worth the squeeze. So we didn't choose that very much more aggressive option. And one of the reasons we didn't do that was because at that time, as I said, GE had been spending a decade generating intense local opposition in that 40-mile stretch to us doing any dredging at all. They had done a huge amount of fear-mongering through their public relations campaign, and we had lots and lots of municipalities and individuals and groups and so forth who were opposed to any kind of extensive dredging program. And the concerns that they used were, well, you're going to have too much resuspension. So resuspension is what happens when you take a dredge and you pick up a bucket full of mud, some of it falls back in and gets spread out again. So that's resuspension. And they said, you're going to leave too much behind, too much residual is going to be behind. You won't be able to really clean up even the areas that you're intending to dredge. They'll have a lot of stuff left over and you really won't achieve any result. And it's going to take too long. And it's going to be noisy, and there's going to be light pollution for the people who live nearby, and you're going to have smells and odors, and it's going to disrupt boating and so forth. So for those reasons, we didn't select that contributed to our decision to not select the more aggressive option. GE argued about resuspension, and GE had this graph that you're seeing here that says they have modeled what will happen under various different scenarios. So on the vertical axis, you have PCB concentration. On the horizontal axis, you have periods of time. The heavy black line was what the model suggested would occur if you did nothing. If you just leave it alone, that's what will happen. The dotted lines near the bottom that go horizontally, the first one, which is around 0.4, that's the first of those 2 interim milestones, and the lower one at 0.2, that's the second of those 2 milestones. And so it was achieving those milestones at some reasonable period of time that was one of the goals. And this graph GE used to try and show how bad resuspension would be. The purple, the lowest line at the bottom of the graph, I guess you would call it bluish or purplish, that was what they hypothesized would happen if you had 0% resuspension, which everybody agreed would be unrealistic. And then these other lines, the green one is for 1%, this orange one is for 3%, this purple line is for 5% resuspension. And GE actually argued that the real outcome was likely to be closer to 7%. So they said, really, it's even going to be worse than what's shown on this graph. So we'll come back to that and say what actually happened. Here's the project timeline. As I said, in 2002, we issued the ROD. The state of New York concurred enthusiastically. The environmental groups all applauded and stood up with us at the press release and gave us great applause. From 03 to 05, GE took 50,000 samples in that 40-mile stretch to design the project. They did that under EPA order. In 06, they entered into a judicial consent decree with us and committed. It was a little unusual. In fact, it is, I think, unique to this day. They committed to perform the first year of dredging, which would be then followed by a reassessment to see whether or not it was working and whether any of the rules of the road have to change. And then after that, GE would be called upon to make a decision of either to opt in or opt out for the remainder of the work. So this was kind of unique in the history of Superfund consent decrees. Well, in 07, they began construction of the treatment plant because all these sediments, when they get dug up, have to be treated. They have to be dewatered. The water that gets squeezed out of the sediment has to be treated back to drinking water standards, discharged back in the river. And the dried sediment then has to be packed into railroad cars and shipped across the country to various disposal locations. That they began in 07, and in 09, they got around to actually beginning the dredging. And in 10, we did have that reassessment. EPA stood by the record of decision. At that time, Lisa Jackson was the administrator of EPA. This decision went right up to her. GE vigorously lobbied against it at that time, said, no, it's still not working. You got to really scale this back. GE's president personally went and visited twice with Lisa Jackson. Lisa Jackson ultimately said, nope, we stand by the regional office. The regional office says this is a good project, go ahead. In 2011, GE opted in. In 2011 to 2015, GE did the work and they completed it as called for in the record of decision. This, by the way, is an aerial photograph of the treatment plant that they built. This is no small project. This was a 100-acre treatment plant, cost $100 million. It's actually on a canal that connects to the Hudson River. It's not in the main stem of the Hudson River. But you see here the docking facilities, you see all the offloading facilities, tankage there. There's underground pumps that pump it over to the treatment facilities here where the water is squeezed. The water is squeezed out and then the water itself is treated. Then the dried material is stored here. Some other debris that has PCB contamination was stored here. And they built 8 miles of railroad tracks that allowed them to bring in 3 railroad trains, each with 81 cars, all at the same time. One loaded and ready to move out, one being loaded, and one empty waiting to get loaded. So this was a dramatic thing that they built. It's now being made available to the local county and so forth it's a perfect intermodal transfer facility because you got rail, you got water, and the highway is just a couple of miles away. This is what the dredging actually looked like. They used, by the way, and Beth and other air people will appreciate this, they used Tier 4 diesel equipment. So they had the best of all possible diesel equipment. We asked them to do that and they agreed. They had what's called environmental dredges. These are hydraulically operated dredges so that when the mouth of the dredge is actually hydraulically closed, so it has a better fit than other kinds of dredges. Still, you do get spillback. There's no doubt about that. The material was then put into big barges and moved upstream through the lock and to the canal and to the treatment plant. So what were the results? They removed 2.75 million cubic yards of contaminated sediment, about 100,000 cubic yards more than had been projected. During the project, we discovered that there was significantly greater mass, more pounds or more kilograms of PCBs in the sediment that had been projected at the time of the ROD. The consequence was that they removed an estimated 310,000 pounds of PCBs, approximately twice what we had projected would be removed. and an estimated 72% of the overall total PCB mass estimated to be in that sediment of that 40-mile stretch. So nearly 3/4. So that exceeded the 65% reduction that we had assumed in the rod. But of course, it also meant that the non-dredged areas, the areas we had said would have to be clean themselves over time, they also had more PCBs than had originally been projected, also about twice as much. However, resuspension, this was really good news. They remember that we had estimated, by the way, we had estimated 3% in the rod. And GE had argued, well, it could be as high as 7%. In the event, it actually was only 1.5%. Half of our estimate and only a quarter or less than a quarter of GE's estimate. Why? Because GE did a really good job. GE fights and fights and fights and fights, but once they finally decide to do the work, they did a fabulous job. As required in the CD, they planted over 1 million individual plants to do habitat restoration. It was, and I think to this day it is, the largest environmental dredging project to date, even bigger than the Fox River in Region 5, even bigger than Portland Harbor in Region 10. We've got another one coming down the pike, Passaic River and Hackensack River behind that, which will probably both be bigger, but it was big. And it cost GE an estimated $1.7 billion. That's at a time when billions actually meant more than they do today. Generated 500 jobs during the work, which actually created the biggest economic boom in this area of New York, of upper New York State, that it had in 50 years. And so the people ended up, who hated it originally, ended up loving it because it created all of this economic benefit and it created this infrastructure there. And there were virtually none of these quality of life concerns that GE had been fear-mongering about. Virtually none of them were materialized. Again, thanks to, we had set some quality of life standards that they had to meet, and GE met them. But the controversy came. In 2015, NOAA published, this was after the dredging, as the dredging was about to go enter its last year. In the beginning of 2015, NOAA published a study saying, hey, you know, EPA used an overly optimistic, what's called the decay rate, which is how fast this natural reduction of PCBs will take place on its own. And if so, they said, time for fish recovery is going to be much, much longer than EPA estimated. In 2016, we published a detailed 45-page rebuttal. And here was the problem. So the problem was that there were only a handful of data sets to evaluate how quickly the undredged areas would clean themselves. And at the time of the record of decision, there were only two. There was this one from 1991 and this one from 1998. And that generated an 8% annual decay rate. If you did the calculations back then, that was what it came up with. But in that big, big, heavy 50,000 samples event that GE did in 02 to 05, if you take all of that data, it was way up here with a less than 3% decay rate. So at the time that NOAA published its study, they ignored these two data points down here, which were from the 2011 to 2013 timeframe, two different studies there, which, depending on what point you start from, could generate a 5% reduction, or a 14% reduction, or a 4% reduction. So the NOAA simply ignored these two data points, and they ignored this data point, and they used only this data point in their study that said, oh, EPA, you've been too optimistic. Bottom line is, we really don't know. Our best guess is that the probable number is around 5%. So under the Superfund law, every 5 years, we have to issue something called a 5-year review. We have to go back and look at the site and see whether the remedy that we have put in place is still protective. The first of those actually occurred during the time that the work was still underway, so it's kind of irrelevant. The second one came up in was due in 2017. And we published a draft 5-year review, finding that the project will be protective when the natural attenuation period is complete. And remember that the ROD already had predicted that to be 50 to 60 years. We got over 2,000 comments on this 5-year review, most of them saying, hey, you got to do more dredging. You didn't do enough. And at that point, the state of New York jumped on the bandwagon. Now, remember, 2017, we're in the Trump administration. The state of New York, of course, was in a Democratic administration. And so there was some political motivation here about this as well. But we had these other federal agencies, NOAA and Fish and Wildlife Service, who were actually also complaining about us, as well as the Enviros and the NGOs. They all recommended that EPA conclude the remedy is not protective and you should do more dredging. So EPA delayed issuance of the 5-year review pending collection of additional sediment samples that New York State had decided to take because we refused to do it. So New York State said, all right, we're going to take 1,200 more samples. And we did collaborate with them very, very closely on coming up with that sampling plan. And they did all of that sampling work. And finally, in 2019, we finally issued the second 5-year review. By the way, it was 1,000 pages long. It's the longest 5-year review. It's longer than most remedial investigations and feasibility studies for most Superfund sites. Very unheard of for a 5-year review, which is normally 50, 60 pages long. What we did is we deferred our determination of protectiveness until sufficient additional years of post-dredging sediment and fish tissue data are collected to support a scientifically reliable evaluation of the improvement in concentrations in fish, because biologists agree, and there is widespread agreement on this, even among the opponents or the people who are critics, agree that at least 8 or more years of post-dredging fish tissue data will be needed to really identify a trend with a sufficient degree of scientific confidence. So what have we found? So if we look at data pre-dredging data versus post-dredging data from this period, 2016 to 2021, that's the post-dredging years for which we currently have validated data. Let's look first at the water column. Now, you need to understand that this graph here on the upper left-hand side is a logarithmic scale. At the bottom of the graph is 0.1. These are parts per billion, well, it's nanograms per liter. So I think that's parts per billion. We have 0.1, 1, and 10. So each major segment is an order of magnitude more concentrated. So what looks like a very small improvement is actually in river section 1, a 52% improvement in the water column concentrations. In river section 2 and river section 3, a 40% improvement in water column concentrations. So that's a pretty good improvement in this period of time. Again, it's a logarithmic scale, so it doesn't look like it's that much of an improvement, but it is. Down here, we also have a log scale. This is sediment improvement. Again, river section 1, 93% improvement in the average sediment concentrations. Again, not a surprise because that was where we did the majority of the dredging. We did almost bank-to-bank dredging in that 6-mile stretch. River section 2, which is the site of the biggest controversy, where the critics want us to go back and do more dredging, we nevertheless are seeing an 83% improvement in sediment concentrations there. And even in river section 4, where the least amount of area was dredged, nevertheless, we're seeing an 84% improvement in sediments. So these graphs here on the left-hand side are pretty good. On the right-hand side, it's not quite as good. So we've got different kind of fish that we look at. We actually look at about 6 or 7 different species of fish. But if we look at the brown bullhead, which is one of our indicator species, there we're doing pretty well. We got about a 50% reduction. River section 1, better than 50% reduction. River section 2, almost exactly 50%, and river section 3, almost exactly 50%, with a little bit of an error bar, a pretty small error bar. So these are statistically significant changes, right? The black bass, however, not as good. Still pretty good in river section 1. Again, not a surprise. That's where most of the dredging got done. But a surprisingly less good improvements in river sections 2 and 3. Now, some of this is random chance. It depends how old the fish are that you happen to catch. The older fish have been around longer, and they've picked up more PCBs than the younger fish do. Nevertheless, there is a lag time. There's a lag time built into the system. We understand that, but it's lagging more than we had anticipated, and we're not exactly sure why. As we said, however, environmental data, as everybody knows, is extremely variable from year to year. And that's why we say you need at least 8 years of good data to identify a trend. We aren't quite there yet, so we got a couple more years that we have to collect data on and look at. But this is where this is what the controversy is all about. Here's another way of looking at fish tissue PCB levels before, during, and after dredging compared to those interim milestones. So this is an average fish. We call it a Frankenfish because it's a weighted average of all the different species in all the different locations. And these are the different years. The pre-dredging years are in blue, the during the dredging years are in this orange color, and the post-dredging years are in green. Again, no surprise that went up again during the dredging. That there is a lot of activity, a lot of resuspension, but it's gone down pretty quickly to better than pre-dredging levels, but we haven't hit the milestone that we were supposed to hit. That first milestone after 5 years. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We're already at 7 and we're not quite there yet. So again, this is the source of the controversy. The critics are saying, hey, look at this. You're not achieving the goals that you intended to achieve. It's not working. You got to do something more. We don't feel that that's accurate. We certainly don't think we currently have enough data to support a decision to go back into the river and collect another 1 million cubic yards or 500,000 cubic yards or 300,000 cubic yards or whatever it would be. So what are the observations? Well, as expected, the system has altered, has been altered. We've seen good improvements across the board, but not as much in fish as we would like. We think eight years of data are really necessary. Looking ahead, General Electric remains obligated under the consent decree to carry out the OM&M, operation, maintenance, and monitoring work for decades and decades to come. Long-term monitoring is going to be required. We're going to continue to do 5-year reviews. In fact, the third one is planned for this year. And GE is currently performing a study of the floodplains. Every time that the Hudson River flooded, PCBs were deposited on the 80 miles of floodplains along that 40-mile stretch of the Upper Hudson. GE is now doing an RIFS for that, and we expect to have a ROD on that one a couple of years from now. And EPA is now looking at PCBs in the lower Hudson River, from Troy all the way down to New York City. GE is legally responsible for all of that, and GE is actually under order right now to start doing the data acquisition for that lower Hudson River study. So that brings us to our Q&A section. I think I went a couple of minutes longer than I'd planned, but Dave, it's over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Walter. No problem at all on the timing on this, and excellent presentation. It's clearly an example of that our EPA work is long haul and heavy lifting, and you know, all of us to one degree or another have experienced that in the 10 regions. I'm not going to get into a battle on Fox River versus Hudson River. We can do that over a drink sometime. Just starting with a very narrow technical question, you referred to the dredging as hydraulic dredging, but I saw these big clamshells.
I'm sorry, I missed. So I wasn't clear. The dredges, the clamshells themselves are hydraulically operated. So old-fashioned dredges would simply work by gravity. The dredge would go down, and then when it was pulled up, gravity would allow it to close. But that was a pretty bad closure. These newer dredges, there's hydraulics right on the dredge head, and it forces the mouths of the dredge to close so that you get a better closure and you get less resuspension, less draw, less pour back as the dredge comes up out of the water.
You know, it was my understanding that a fair amount of dredging had been, I'll call it pure hydraulic dredging.
Right, you use a vacuum cleaner basically and suck the stuff up.
Yeah, was that discussed? And
it was considered in the record of decision, extensively considered and rejected. There are benefits to it, but there are also a lot of problems. For one thing, we were trying to get all the way down. Remember, nowadays what we would have done, and I've said this publicly, so I'm not giving out any secrets here. If I were writing this record of decision today, I wouldn't do this mass removal effort. What I would say is dredge several feet in larger amounts of area and put caps on it. What we did find, because there were some areas in the Upper Hudson that we did have to cap, where you would get really close to a bridge abutment, or you get close to a steep bank or something like that, and you can't dredge. Those areas had to be capped. And we had a massive gargantuan flood. They did some of that capping in 2009, the first year of dredging. And in 2010, when we did the reassessment, coincidentally that year, we had the largest flow of water coming down the Hudson River ever recorded in the springtime during the spring thaw. and it was massive. And we went back afterwards, GE under our direction, went back afterwards to look at the areas. The areas that had not been scoured that did the best were the areas that had been capped, because the cap was carefully built. So we were comfortable that capping would work. And nowadays what we would do, and this is what we did in the Passaic River, we said, take off 2 feet, put a cap on. In some high energy areas, take off 4 feet, put an armored cap in, and don't try and get out the 10 or 12 feet worth of soft, heavily contaminated sediment. Up in the Hudson River, we did. We said, go down 5 feet, go down 8 feet, go down whatever it takes and try and get out the mass. So it was a mass removal target, and that we wouldn't do today.
Okay. Walter, did you run into any disposal site issues or problems?
Oh, we did. We ran into difficulties of siting the treatment plant. There was all sorts of NIMBYism about that. Initially, actually pre-EPA's record of decision, way back in the 1970s, when the state of New York was first going after GE. At that time, they had GE do a little bit of dredging or removal of what were called some remnant areas. When that Fort Edward Dam was removed, suddenly the water level went down 10, 15 feet in that big area behind the dam. And there were remnant areas on the edges that were now exposed that had PCB contamination in them. The state of New York required those to be cleaned up. And at that time, looking ahead, they said, oh, maybe we'll site a cleanup, a treatment plant right up here on the banks of the Hudson River. Why not? That'll be convenient if we have to do more dredging. Well, that ran into a total buzzsaw of local opposition. So by the time we got to doing our record of decision, we realized that was a complete non-starter, and we didn't even think about it. So we directed, no, it's going to be off-site disposal at existing permitted areas, and you're going to do it by train. In those train cars, each load is going to get carefully wrapped up like a burrito, and they're going to go across the country. And they went to Ohio, and they went to Michigan, and they went to Idaho, and they went to Utah, and they went to Texas and Missouri. I mean, there were various places that it went to.
Yeah, that's always a difficult thing to deal with in terms of the ultimate, well, the disposal site and,
Right.
and things like that. Just had one thing, Ed Hanley raised a question about whether or not the slides will be available, and
Absolutely, yes.
Walter has given permission.
I added a couple of things to it today. I added some of the photos, so I'm going to send you the updated version and you can share that, all right?
Very good, very good. Actually, a question came in from the RPM on the Fox River.
Uh-oh.
I will not disclose his name at this point, and it actually fits with another question that had come in earlier. And, you know, this may sound like an oxymoron, but are there things that can be done to accelerate natural attenuation? And related to that, the thickness of caps that are put down.
Sure.
Yeah.
I don't know that it's related, because the natural attenuation in our judgment is in the areas that are not capped.
Yeah.
Our assumption is any areas that had to get, either we cleaned off the area and got it all the way to as clean as we wanted it to be in that mass per unit area. In the areas that were called for dredging, the objective is that GE had to dredge, that they had to dredge till the point that we reached our cleanup objectives. There were those caps were put in areas that you couldn't dredge, but were supposed to, where the concentrations were high enough so that the dredging should have been done there, but you couldn't do it because it's right next to a bridge abutment, or it's right next to a bank, or there's other problems that just made it impossible to get the dredges in on really shallow areas or something like that. So those were the areas that were capped. And then there were all these other areas that were neither dredged nor capped. And so the natural attenuation is focused on the areas that were neither dredged nor capped, because that's where the PCBs that were there are continue to be exposed to the biota, or the biota exposed to the PCBs. So the capping, to answer the question that I think was being asked, is how thick were our caps? Basically a 2-foot cap. It had to be an engineered cap that was placed over areas that required capping. But the natural attenuation is focused on the areas that were neither dredged nor capped. And that's where, and then the other question is, well, can you do anything to accelerate natural attenuation? I'm not aware of anything you can do, but maybe the Fox River RPM has some ideas about this. After all, I'm a lawyer by training, not an engineer or a scientist. I only play one on TV, right? So it's a good question. I know that one of the holy grails of PCB and other contaminant remediation has been could we find naturally occurring or engineered bacteria that would eat these things? And the answer is there are, as I understand it, there are bacteria that eat PCBs, but every place where you find PCBs, it would probably require a different strain of these bacteria to be effective. And then you don't know how long they're going to be effective. You don't know what other side effects there might be. You know, do these bacteria then evolve and morph into something even more horrible? So, you know, but this is one of the things that for 30, 40 years, PCB scientists have been thinking about bacteria that could eat those things. We also think about bacteria that could eat other contaminants or plastics or things of that sort. So I don't know, it's the holy grail that you could somehow figure out a way to accelerate natural attenuation. I'm not aware that it's happened yet. And by the way, I will give kudos to the Fox River. The Hudson River generated very little litigation. There was one case that General Electric took all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States. The Supreme Court kicked them out, but that was as far as it went, where they tried to challenge the constitutionality of Section 106 of the Superfund law, which is the section that allows EPA to issue unilateral administrative orders to responsible parties, forcing them to do cleanups. And at that time, when GE brought that case, they knew and they were concerned that if they didn't agree to do the work, we would issue a unilateral order trying to force them to do the work. So they preemptively challenged the constitutionality of that section of Superfund and said, because it doesn't give us a due process of law, it's unconstitutional. And no less a lawyer than Lawrence Tribe of Harvard represented them in this case. I actually was called as an expert witness for EPA on 106 orders and was deposed for an entire day in the run-up to the case. A couple of other EPA personnel were also deposed. Ultimately, the case, GE lost the case and the government won the case. It was declared to be constitutional. But that and the earlier New York State litigation way back in 2007, excuse me, in 1977, were the only litigations that ever came out of the Hudson River PCB Superfund site, compared to the Fox River, which is like the world's largest amount of litigation, and all these incredible decisions that have come out about recycling and whether recyclers can or can't be held responsible, and and whether it's divisible harm or not divisible harm, and on and on and on. And so the Fox River has been a font of litigation and decisions. Some of them, I might add, inconsistent decisions by the same court over time, but nevertheless, it's a great source of good decisions, mostly good decisions on Superfund litigation. So thank you to Region 5 for that.
Okay, well, it was pretty painful as we went forward, but we had seven PRPs. I see Bill Muno's picture there. I don't know if we had it right, but
yeah. Hi, Walter. Yeah, 7 is right, Dave.
Yeah,
7 paper companies.
Yeah, they didn't get along very well with one another. As a matter of fact, after I retired, they asked me to, and well after the conflict of interest time, to come and mediate. It was a total disaster and waste of a day to do that. Hey, a very obvious thing, Walter, but going back, somebody made a decision back in 1973 to take that dam out and spread the PCBs, over tens and hundreds of miles of the Hudson River. We've got over 2,000 dams in tributaries to the Great Lakes, I know, and a lot of them are not, there's no ownership claimed, and they're all there. Obviously, it would have been a heck of a lot better to not remove the dam and try to remove the PCBs from above the dam. Huh?
Exactly right. Now, the decision to move the dam was made, it was actually, the actual removal took place in 73. The decision was made a few years earlier because they had to design it, they had to get permits for it and all of that stuff. So it was actually being made, probably the decisions were already being made in the late 60s and at the beginning of the 70s. Let's face it, nobody was thinking about PCBs, right? PCBs became, so I joined EPA in August of 1975. And as I walked in the door, PCBs were the contaminant du jour, but they were pretty new at that time. They were sort of new to be thinking about it. So I don't know whether it started in 73 or 4 or when that real, the focus on PCBs began, but the huge failing was exactly what you just said. It was that the state of New York, in authorizing or allowing the removal of the dam, at a time when maybe they might have already been thinking about PCBs, didn't.
Yeah.
And nobody really thought about it. And so you're exactly right. The obvious thing would have been go in behind the dam, dredge all that crap out, get rid of it. And then if you need to take the dam down, take the dam down, do it in an organized way. But, you know, it didn't happen that way. And
Yeah.
PCBs are all the way down as right now, still to this day, they're sitting in New York City Harbor. And among other things, they cause the maintenance dredging of the New York City Harbor, which is about 6 million cubic yards a year that has to be dredged just to keep the harbor open. They cause that to be extremely much more expensive than it otherwise would be because of all the PCBs. There's also dioxin from the Passaic River Superfund site, but between those two, which also shouldn't have been dumped into the river, between those two, that's what causes so much expense, unnecessary expense to keep the harbor open.
If the dam removal had FERC approval as well?
I don't know the answer to that question. I assume that it would have had it at the time because it was owned by the Niagara Mohawk Power Company, which is now owned by National Grid. So the company still exists and it's still generating power elsewhere. I'm sure that they had their FERC licenses elsewhere. I don't know the answer to that question though. It's a good one.
One of the other questions that came in, and I won't name any names, but he said that the CEO of General Electric took quite a personal interest in this and fought it tooth and nail. And
right. I'm terrible with names. What was the guy's name who was the legendary
Jack Welch. Jack Welch.
Jack Welch.
Yeah.
And here's what pissed him off. So back in the 1970s, he settled that lawsuit from the state of New York for pennies.
Yeah.
I mean, for something like $7 million. He settled the entire lawsuit, not only for the Hudson River PCB site, which didn't exist yet, but they knew it was a Hudson River issue, but also for 6 or 7 other sites that GE had around New York State. I think there were 7 sites altogether that New York State sold out for a few million bucks. And so Jack Welch thought, oh, that was a great settlement, fabulous settlement. And then along comes Superfund and along comes EPA and says, well, we don't care about that settlement, it has nothing to do with us. And that pissed him off absolutely no end.
Yeah.
So he dug his heels in and he fought, and that was that whole fight during the 80s and 90s. I remember sitting here in Region 2 when we were thinking about what that first interim rod would be, and they came in there already and they argued, hey, the dredging is going to be a disaster, don't do it. So
do I remember correctly that there was a fairly high-level DOJ attorney who was in-house with GE as well?
Exactly, and somebody on this call will undoubtedly remember his name. I'm absolutely terrible with names, but yes, it was it was a guy who had headed up the environmental enforcement section in EES. He was a terrific lawyer for the EPA at that time during the early 70s, and then he left DOJ and went to General Electric, and he may have on his way passed through a law firm before he went to General Electric, but either way, Steve Ramsey. Steve Ramsey, thank you very much.
Yeah, there we go. How could we forget?
Absolutely, Steve Ramsey, yeah. Who, you know, still he was always somebody I liked and always a good acquaintance. I'm not sure he or I would call each other friends. We just don't know each other that well, but certainly a good acquaintance. And always had an entertaining time when we chatted. He was a very, very, very smart and capable guy, but we had some. And then later on, during the time of the reassessment, which is when I was no longer in the legal office, which is where I'd been during the 70s and 80s and 90s. By the time of the reassessment in the year 2010, I was the head of the Superfund program in Region 2. And so I was deeply involved in this whole reassessment argument, and GE was once again arguing, no, this is a crazy idea, it's not working well, it's a disaster. And a woman who later on became, who had previously been EPA's general counsel, was at that time the head internal, and her name was Ann, somebody else. Ann Lee. Thank you. And so we had all these ex-EPAers that were constantly involved, ex-EPAers or DOJers, who were involved in it all the time. And again, Ann and I got along very, very well together. She was very, very smart. And I hope she felt that I was up to it. And so I think we had a lot of professional disagreements, but on the other hand, we were able to talk openly and we were able to ultimately talk constructively. And it was one of the most interesting, intense, but one of the most interesting times I've ever had in my entire career. Again, up and down to the administrator a couple of times, with the NGOs coming in and meeting with the administrator, the state of New York coming in and lobbying the administrator, GE coming in and lobbying the administrator. And it was quite a remarkable experience. In that bullet room there is where all those meetings were always held. So
Yeah, we could turn this into a name that former EPA
Well,
or
hello.
EPA person.
I'm Rich Siegel.
What I didn't, I'm not sure about that one, but Walter, can you talk just a little bit about the community engagement dynamic? And it
Yeah.
sounds like it's still very active, particularly from the NGO standpoint, but
So the original community engagement, so of course EPA, we're all about it with community engagement. And the original community engagement in this site was when we issued,
That's all right. I'm okay.
I think we got some people who need to put themselves on mute.
Yeah, mute, Chuck, I think.
So the first major bit of public interaction we had was after Carol Browner announced the proposed cleanup plan in late 2000. We then went on to have a big public hearings, multiple meetings, but one huge big public meeting about the proposed plan. And it ended up like, we had a big venue that was able to hold, I don't know, 300 or 400 people or 500 people, and it had an overflow. And I think we ended up having 1,000 people show up or 1,200 people show up. And about 2/3 of them were violently opposed to dredging because they were buying into the whole GE campaign. And about 1/3 of them were absolutely urging us to do the cleanup. That was the the Hudson Sloop Clearwater and the River Keeper and a handful of others. So it was a very, very intense thing. It went on for hour after hour. I was not actually there. I was not involved at that time. But some of you may remember Rich Caspi.
Walter?
Hi, Bonnie, how you doing?
Hi. So I'm going to just chime in here because I was next to Walter during a good deal of this. And I just wanted to raise this because the community engagement on the Hudson River really became a model for very positive community engagement all around the country. And the meeting that Walter is talking about was a meeting that took place in the Saratoga Civic Center, and there were actually 3,000 people
I got
present.
it off by an order of magnitude.
1,500 on each side. And we knew there was so much anger, part of which was the fancy New Yorkers are coming up from the city and telling us what to do. And at that point, we couldn't get ahead of ourselves. We sat down and we did something that I don't know if it's been done elsewhere. We actually commissioned a review of the community engagement on the Hudson site by an independent contractor who criticized us in writing and gave us a critique of what the community wanted. They did extensive interviews and made recommendations to us. And at that point, we changed personnel. We opened a local office in Glens Falls. We hired local people to do community engagement. We hired somebody local to actually be the project manager on the site. And over time, with a very vigorous program of community engagement that brought all the stakeholders, even though they were fighting with each other, to the table on a regular basis, we were really able to turn things around. On the one thing I will say that we didn't ever turn around was I was standing next to Walter on the banks of the Hudson. There were hundreds of reporters for the press conference, and we wanted to show that first bucket coming out of the river. And we also wanted to demonstrate how clean it was. And within 5 minutes of the start of this press conference, GE actually physically moved the barge so that the dredge itself, the bucket, was blocked and you couldn't see that there was water, and therefore potential reef suspension. And we about had a fit. It was nevertheless a very positive event. So
Well,
GE was tough on every aspect of this.
Bonnie is exactly right. And the community advisory group that she helped set up, it continues to be in operation today, and it is really a model. I have one more really interesting anecdote, and we have a few minutes, if Dave, with your permission, I think
Please
this would be a
do,
very
please do, Walter, please do.
So as I told you earlier, Carol Browner in December of 2000, in the waning days of the Clinton administration, she came up to New York and announced the proposed cleanup plan. January 20th, Bush the younger becomes president. That's January 20th, 2001. And immediately GE goes into overdrive, and they were already in overdrive beforehand, lobbying the new incoming Bush administration to say, get rid of this dredging idea. They offered eventually, during the next couple of months, they offered to dredge 25,000 cubic yards compared to the 2.65 million cubic yards that we were proposing be dredged. During that period of time, from January until late July, early August, that intense effort was going on, that lobbying effort was going on, and EPA headquarters, specifically the then chief of staff, Eileen McGinnis, was in frequent communication with Bill Musinski, at that time our DRA, and Rich Caspi, the then division director, who were the authors of this. And they were trying to push us. Headquarters was really trying to actively push us. Couldn't you accept something like this? Couldn't you accept something less? Couldn't you do less? And in the last week of July of 2001, I was the regional counsel. I was sitting in the conference room with Bill Musinski and with Rich Caspi. And we were on a conference call. This was in the days before video conferencing, with Eileen McGinnis and a couple of other people. And basically, they were pushing Bill to come up with a different record of decision. And finally, Bill said, and I watched this and I saw him put his career on the line, and he ultimately paid the price for it. I watched him say, well, you know, you could withdraw the delegation from us. You can issue the record of decision yourself down at headquarters. I will send you a memorandum recommending what I think is appropriate, giving you the full record. I'll send the administrative record down to you, and you can issue the record of decision as you see fit. He was, of course, at that time, the acting regional administrator. We didn't yet have a permanent RA. We were only 6 months into the new administration. So it was the last week of July in 2001. And he did that, and he basically told the administration, told the headquarters folks, I'm not going to play ball with you. 10 days later, the then Republican governor of the state of New York, George Pataki, came out publicly endorsing the cleanup proposal that Carol Browner had announced 7 months earlier. That was in the first week of August of 2001. And of course, at that point, it became impossible for the Republican administration in Washington, D.C. to undercut the Republican governor of the state in which this cleanup was taking place. So had that conversation with Bill Musinski not taken place when it did, but had it taken place 2 weeks later, the entire dynamic would have been different. The conversation wouldn't have taken place. So Bill put his career on the line. I saw it. I knew it at the time that he was doing that. And sure enough, when the new regional administrator came on board, which was months later. Oh, and then, by the way, 2 months after that came 9/11, or a month and a half after that came 9/11. The collapse of the World Trade Center. And suddenly Bill Musinski was the acting RA on the scene there. So they couldn't do anything to him at that point. It took him another year and a half, but eventually they asked him to leave EPA. He got himself an IPA appointment with the Delaware River Basin Commission, which was a very nice gig, very good for him, very, very suited to his skills, and happened to be 20 minutes away from where he lives, so even better commute. And he ended up having a terrific career with the Delaware River Basin Commission for another 20 years. But he lost his EPA job because of that act of bureaucratic integrity. And I have for years, especially once I became EPA DRA, I've always wondered, would I have had the guts to do that? And I'm afraid the answer might be no. I don't know. I mean, one hopes not to be put into that position. But then when Bill actually finally left EPA, I did speak to him. I said, I remember that event. I remember sitting there and watching you sacrifice your career for doing the right thing. So very, very impressive moment.
Well, Walter, I am extremely confident that the answer would have been yes, and you would have done the same thing. And what today has illustrated, and for me, the real joy at EPA was working with people like you. And as someone just said in the chat, unsung heroes. And I guess you're the Anthony Fauci of EPA, and that's a compliment, Walter. That is.
I take it that way. I take it that way.
Yeah. And, what you have demonstrated as the best of public service is something that I admire you a great deal for, and always enjoyed working with you. And I hope one way or another we can cross paths a little bit more. And I've got a few more stories I want to exchange with you, but thank you very much. This was excellent, and we appreciate it, and we wish you all the best in the future. And we look forward to you joining the Alumni Association either right now or in
3 more months.
3 more months.
August
Okay.
3rd. That's my exit date.
Okay, well, very good. The Earth will continue to rotate, but perhaps not as balanced as it does now.
Thank you to all of you, and it was wonderful seeing so many good friends from years past, and I do look forward to joining you soon.
Yeah, we didn't lose much of an audience either. Everybody stayed glued to their seats to find out who the next EPA or DOJ former person was.